Welcome to the podcast. In 1932, the government of Western Australia looked at roughly 20,000 emus eating their way through farm country and said, in essence, you know what the situation needs? Machine guns. Which is a sentence so beautifully Australian, it almost feels made up. But it wasn't. This was real. Depression era real. Wheat farmers in Western Australia were already getting hammered by low prices and hard times. And then, a huge emu migration came through. Birds pushing into cultivated land, chewing through crops, trampling fields, smashing fence lines. And fences mattered not just because of the wheat. Once those barriers were damaged, rabbits could get in too, which is like discovering your roof leaks and then raccoons move into the attic. The joke version of this story is, haha, Australia lost a war to birds. The actual version starts with farmers who were in trouble already, looking at one more disaster and saying, we cannot absorb this. The farmers asked for help, and the help they got was military. Soldiers were sent out with Lewis guns, light machine guns, the kind of thing designed for human war, not for chasing large, weirdly athletic birds across open country. Major G.P.W. Meredith was put in charge. And if you're thinking, Simon, surely at that point somebody in government heard themselves and went, hang on. Well, apparently not. Try to picture the opening scene. Western Australia, late 1932. Big open land. Rain making movement harder. Farmers desperate for relief. Soldiers hauling Lewis guns into the bush. Somewhere, thousands upon thousands of emus are just existing with tremendous confidence. And almost immediately, the operation goes sideways. The birds would not line up obligingly. Rude, honestly. They were spread out. The terrain was difficult. Rain complicated the guns and the movement. Distance kept spoiling clean shots. What sounds on paper like overwhelming force turned into a very awkward chase scene with feathers. I mean, this is the tension that makes the whole thing memorable. Because yes, it's absurd that an army was deployed against emus. But the deeper absurdity is that once you choose a theatrical solution, reality gets a vote. Nature does not care how official your paperwork is. It does not care that a man named Major Meredith has shown up with a plan. The emus, to their great credit, or maybe to human embarrassment, turned out to be excellent at avoiding being shot by the deployed Lewis machine guns. Reports from the campaign make the birds sound almost tactically gifted. They split into small groups. They moved fast. Some observers said they seemed to post something like lookouts, one or two birds alert while the rest fed, then the whole group scattering the moment trouble appeared. Now, I don't want to oversell it like they were tiny, feathery field marshals with maps and monocles. But in practical terms, they behaved in exactly the way that made open country shooting frustrating and inefficient. Major Meredith's men would try to get close enough for a useful burst, and the emus would break apart and run. Not in one nice, dense cluster. That would have been convenient, but in smaller units, all darting off across ground they understood better than the soldiers did. An emu can move fast, and once that distance opens up, your fancy military hardware starts looking less like power and more like luggage. Then there were the guns themselves. Lewis guns jammed. Ammunition got burned through at a rate that did not exactly scream efficiency. There are these moments in the story where you can feel the official mood sliding from confidence into that very specific bureaucratic despair of, we have spent a lot of effort on something that is becoming embarrassing. One famous problem was simply that the birds would not stay where the bullets were. That is, admittedly, a core challenge in hunting anything. But here the mismatch was extreme. Military tools are built around concentration, targets, control. This problem was ecological and dispersed. It was weather and migration and landscape and animal behavior. Those are not small details. Those are the problem. And then you get to the casualty figures, which are murky, disputed, claimed and counterclaimed. Depending on the account, you can find very different numbers for how many emus were actually killed. That's usually not a sign of a crisp, triumphant campaign. That's the historical version of everyone leaving a group project with different memories of who did what. Some reports made the operation sound more successful than the ridicule suggests. Others made it sound like total farce. The safe thing to say is this: whatever the exact number of dead emus, the campaign did not solve the farmers' basic crisis. And that's the part I think gets lost when this becomes a pub joke or an internet meme. Because the farmers' pain was real. Wheat prices were bad. The depression was real. Crop loss mattered. Fence damage mattered. If your livelihood is already wobbling, and then tens of thousands of birds arrive like a beaked weather system, you're not laughing. You're doing the grim math at the kitchen table. So no, the lesson isn't that emus are magical, invincible war geniuses. It's simpler and, honestly, more useful than that. A machine gun is a dramatic answer. It is not automatically a smart one. Put differently, if your toolbox contains military operation, you'll be tempted to use it on a problem that is really about land, animals, and infrastructure. And then the toolbox starts shooting at birds while the actual system failure keeps humming along. Publicly, the whole thing became a humiliation. The army was withdrawn after the embarrassment, then sent back briefly, because governments are very human and occasionally respond to failure by having another go at the same bad idea, just with a slightly different face. But the larger answer moved away from soldiers. Over time, the response shifted to bounties and, eventually, exclusion fencing, which is less cinematic than deploy the troops, but also much closer to how you actually manage a persistent animal problem. You don't win a little war against migration. You change incentives, barriers, access. You do the boring thing. History is full of flashy failures and unglamorous fixes. Overseas, the story turned into ridicule. Nation loses to birds is headline catnip. It's concise, humiliating, and kinda perfect. The scandal wasn't merely that officials looked silly. It was that policy failed in a very recognizable way. The problem was real, the suffering was real, and the response was theatrical. That's the bit that sticks with me. Not the punchline, though the punchline is excellent, but the pattern. People under pressure ask for help. Authority wants to look decisive. Decisive gets confused with dramatic. Dramatic gets confused with effective. And suddenly, Major Meredith is out there with Lewis guns, while emus are demonstrating with enormous bird energy that ecosystems do not surrender because a uniform arrived. I was gonna say nobody won, but that's not exactly right. The emus certainly came out of the legend better. The army did not. The farmers, meanwhile, got a lesson they hadn't asked for. If government reaches for spectacle before practicality, the spectacle may be what survives in memory, not the hardship that caused it. So when people call it the Great Emu War, sure, it's a joke about Australia. But it's also a warning label about what happens when you try to solve a natural, structural problem with firepower, because firepower feels satisfyingly official. Sometimes the most ridiculous story in the room is also the most familiar one. See you next time.